Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my March wrap up and talking about some of the books that I read in the month of March. So, I had rather an insane reading month in March. I read a lot of books, In the month of March I read 20 books, which is the most I've ever read in a month. And is probably about double what I would say I read in an average month. So I'm not quite sure how that happened. So out of the 20 books that I somehow managed to read in March, 8 of those were unpublished books that I read for work, so I can't talk to you about them. But I do have 12 other books to talk to you about, so let's get straight into them. Starting off, as always, with the classics. This month I read The Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope. This is the third book in the Palitzer series and one that I really enjoyed. Anthony Trollope is one of my favourite authors, and as a lot of you will know, I'm setting myself a Trollope project this year where I'm reading a different book by Anthony Trollope every month. And The Eustace Diamonds follows a woman called Lizzie Eustace, who is married at a young age to a man who is not very well. He dies very shortly after their wedding, leaving her as a widow with a child, and also having given to her before his death a diamond necklace worth £10,000, which is a lot of money today and was even more money in the Victorian period, which may or may not be a family heirloom, and therefore his family dispute her right to have. And the book basically follows Lizzie and the diamonds and her relationship with her cousin Frank and various people around her. But what is quite fun about this book and what made it very different and really entertaining is that Lizzie is not a nice person at all. She reminded me a lot of Lady Susan from Jane Austen's Lady Susan, a younger Lady Susan and perhaps a less wise Lady Susan. But if you enjoyed Lady Susan, you really must read The Eustace Diamonds because it's very, very good fun, and Lizzie is not very nice. She is quite cunning and mercenary and lies a lot. As often is the case with Trollope, it's a big book with a lot of characters and a lot of plot and a lot of interest. I love his witty writing and I love his characterisation and his plots and his dialogue, and he's just, yeah, he's one of my favourite writers. I enjoyed this one a lot. Another Victorian thing I read this month was the play Widowers' Houses by George Bernard Shaw, which I really enjoyed. This follows a young man who becomes engaged to a young lady who he meets abroad, but he soon discovers that his fiance's father has made his money in various dodgy ways, mostly by being a kind of slum landlord, effectively. And the book kind of follows his moral scruples and the moral scruples of his fiancée and everyone around them. It is a play about the hypocrisies of the middle and upper classes in late Victorian society, and I thought it was very good. I'm not sure I would necessarily say I enjoyed it because it's a play that is supposed to make you feel uncomfortable, I suppose, but it was really interesting. I think I would say that I prefer Mrs. Warren's Profession and Major Barbara of the other work I have read or seen by George Bernard Shaw, but I really enjoyed Widowers' Houses, and it certainly reminded me that I'd like to read more by George Bernard Shaw in the future. Another late 19th century classic I read in the month of March was this. This is Jalaluddin by Rafi, and this is an Armenian classic, and this copy was kindly sent to me by the publishers for review. This is a new translation. I have to say that I had slightly mixed feelings about this. It follows a young man's experience in the Russo-Turkish wars of the late 1870s and kind of looks at relationships between Armenian and Kurdish people and the devastation that happened to a lot of these places at that time. And the main character in this book has kind of become cynical through war, and all of the horrible things that he's seen around him have made him into not a very nice person for understandable reasons, but that also means he has become as violent and as ruthless as many of the people who have caused devastation to the people that he cares about and he loves. This novella deals with some really, really interesting ideas, and I found it really fascinating to read, but I also feel like I would have got quite a lot more out of it if I had known more of the history, because I found it quite confusing. And also it's very, very short. It's only about sort of 70 pages, and I felt like I could do with a lot more. It was interesting to read an Armenian classic because I've never read one before, and it was certainly an interesting book, but I kind of was left wanting a little bit more depth, I suppose, at the end. So yeah, mixed feelings on that one, but I am glad that I read it. Moving on to some classics from the early 20th century. This month I read Where Angels Fear to Tread by Ian Forster, which I adored. I love Ian Forster. He's fast becoming one of my favourite writers. He's just got a fantastic turn of phrase and really subtle, clever characterisation, and his plots never go the way you expect them to, which I think is really fun. I think it's partly because I'm really familiar with Victorian literature, and Ian Forster is writing sort of just after the Victorian period is end, and I don't know if it's just like a shift in the way Edwardian literature tends to differ from Victorian literature, or if it's something Ian Forster does in terms of playing with like the form of the Victorian novel, but when I read Victorian literature I can often like work out vaguely where the plot's going to go, to a certain extent, not always. And then Ian Forster, like a lot of his books start like they're going to be a conventional Victorian novel, and then he does something completely different and you never know where the plot's going to go, and none of the characters fall in love with the people who the narrative requires them to fall in love with for it to be a more conventional story, which I just think is really fun and really awesome. Anyway, that's kind of a slight tangent, but Ian Forster's great. This follows a woman called Lila, who is a widow in her early 30s, and her late husband was from a upper class English family, and she amazes her late husband's family by suddenly deciding to marry a Italian working class man 10 years her junior. Everything kind of goes on from there. I don't want to say more about it because, as I said, the plots in Ian Forster are really, really clever. But it's really, really good. I really enjoyed it and definitely looking forward to reading more Ian Forster in the future. This is one of my favourite books of this month. And I also read Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery, and this I buddy read with Hannah Tay, whose channel I'll link down below. This was quite a fun and interesting read. I feel like this is a book that I ought to have read a while ago, or that's kind of been half on my radar for quite a long time, and I've just never got round to reading it. This is a Canadian children's classic. It was written in the early 20th century, and it follows a little girl called Anne who is an orphan, and what happens when she goes to live in a place called Green Gables and is adopted by a brother and sister who live there. The brother and sister who live there wanted to adopt an orphan boy so that he could help them around the farm, but through a mix-up they end up getting a girl instead, and they end up getting Anne, who is not what they expect and not what anyone expects, because she is very, very eccentric and doesn't stop talking. But then slowly but surely Marilla and Matthew, the brother and sister who have adopted her, come to care about her deeply, and we kind of follow Anne as she grows up from, I think she's about 11 at the beginning of the book, and then she's sort of 16 and a half at the end, so it's a real kind of coming of age story. I really enjoyed this. It's very good fun. Anne is incredibly entertaining, and her dialogue is really witty and really rich and really, really well written, because she is such an odd character, but really, really fun. And it's kind of full of imagination and life, which I really enjoyed. I also enjoyed learning about like early 20th century Canada, because it's not a period I know very much about. I would say that I think I preferred the first half to the second, partly because Anne is like even more eccentric when she's younger, and then as she starts to grow up and mature, she's slightly less fun, though still really enjoyable. So I did really enjoy it. I think I would be interested in reading the rest of the books in the series, but I don't think I have like a burning desire to do so. I then also read The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie, which was really good fun. Again, sometimes I'm just really in the mood for an Agatha Christie, and I really just want a book that I can get through in one sitting, in one day, that's going to be quick and enjoyable and really, really readable. So I got The Body in the Library out of the library, which is entertaining and fitting, and I really, really enjoyed it. This is a Miss Marple novel, and it follows what happens when one couple come downstairs one morning to find a body in their library of someone they have never met before, and police detectives come in to investigate, and Miss Marple comes in to investigate, and it's all twisty and turny and wonderful, as Miss Marple books always are. Really great fun, as Agatha Christie always is, and one I'd heartily recommend. Moving on to contemporary fiction. This month I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and this I read for the Tenterhooks book club, which is run by Emma from Drinking by My Shelf and Angelica Kofar. I'll link their channels down below. This was so good. This is probably my favourite book of the month, maybe, along with Where Angels Fear to Tread and one other that I'll mention. I certainly loved it a lot, and The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo will definitely be on my favourite books of the year list when we come to December 2019. It was just fantastic, and I really, really would recommend it. I listened to the audiobook as well, which I would also very much recommend because it was really, really well done. I think that might be like the fastest I've ever listened to an audiobook, because it's not incredibly short, and I listened to it so quickly because it was just so good, and I was just listening to it all of the time. So The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo has quite a fun setup, a setup that is reminiscent of The 13th Tale, which is perhaps partly one of the reasons why I loved it. A journalist living in New York is one day called to her boss's office to say that the famous film star Evelyn Hugo has said that she wants to do an exclusive interview, and that she wants to do it with this random journalist who hardly anyone has ever heard of for some unknown reason. When this journalist Monique goes to see Evelyn Hugo says that in fact she doesn't want Monique to do an article about her, she wants her to write her biography, and she starts to tell her the story of her life. So it's a story in a story, which I always love. And also, I don't think it's a spoiler to say because it comes out very soon, Evelyn Hugo is this very famous film star who has been married to 7 different men, but actually the love of her life was a woman. And the book looks at bisexuality and gender and kind of sexual identity in a really, really powerful and interesting way. It also looks at like fame and Hollywood and kind of the film industry and the damage it can do in really powerful ways. It also looks at sort of cultural identity. Evelyn Hugo is Cuban but pretends not to be Cuban in order to help her career, and kind of dyes her hair blonde and things like that in order to sort of hide her heritage. And Monique, the journalist, her mother is white and her father was black, but her father died when she was quite young, so she always feels more white. And kind of it deals with so many really interesting issues in a background way that is always like just present in a really compelling story. It's also incredibly moving. moving and like so beautiful. I find it really hard to explain just like how moving this book was. Listening to an audiobook, I was just crying, like I was just like nearly in tears through the whole of the book because it is so powerful and so well done. And the way Taylor Jenkins Reid writes about love is just fantastic. I really, really can't recommend The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo enough. I have decided it was definitely my favourite book of the month. It was so good. I can't wait to read more by her. I'm so excited to have discovered her. I'm so grateful to Emma from Drinking by My Shelf, who this is like her favourite book of all time. I'm so glad that she recommended we read it for the book club because it's so good. And I loved it so, so much. Another fantastic book that I read this month, which also was a favourite and I also expect to end up on my favourite books of the year list, is Affinity by Sarah Waters. I love Sarah Waters a lot. She is a really, really wonderful writer. Just absolutely up my street in terms of her writing style, her building of atmosphere, her characterisation, her like clever twists, and a narrative that is always plot driven and always tense, but also like writing and character led, which is something I really, really enjoy. Affinity is one I hear spoken about less actually, but I definitely preferred it to Fingersmith. I probably can't decide quite between this and Tipping the Velvet, both of which I adore a lot. Affinity is set in the Victorian period and we follow a young woman called Margaret who has recently been ill in circumstances that we don't quite understand. She's bored and she's unhappy and she decides that to give some variation to her life and to kind of do something good, she's going to go visiting at the local prison as a kind of lady visitor to help educate and morally improve perhaps the young ladies in the local prison. And in this prison she meets various women, including the very intriguing Selina Dawes, who is in prison for fraud and assault and who claims to be a medium and who blames the crime she is committed for on a spirit that she says she summoned. And over the course of the book, the relationship between Margaret and Selina grows. I don't want to say more about it than that. It's so well paced, it's so brilliant, the ending was fantastic, and the characterisation and the kind of slow revealing and unravelling of the plot was so good. I really, really love Sarah Waters. This was fantastic, really powerful, really engaging. I would really, really highly recommend Sarah Waters as an author, and I definitely recommend Affinity as a book. I feel like it doesn't get talked about as much as any of the rest of her books, but I think it's so fantastic and I really, really would recommend this. It's so, so good. I then also read Warlight by Michael Ondate. This was on the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, which is one of the reasons why I read it. So I'm going to talk about it in a bit more detail in a Walter Scott Prize review video with a few other books that I've read for that long list. So I won't talk about it in too much detail here. It's set in London shortly after the Second World War, and it follows a young boy called Nathaniel who lives with his sister, and shortly after the war, his parents announce that they are going abroad for a year with his father's work. Shortly after this, Nathaniel and his sister discover his mother's trunk, her suitcase that she was supposed to take abroad with her, in their cellar, and realise that she hasn't gone abroad at all and they have no idea where she is. In the meantime, they are living with a man who they call the Moth, who may or may not be a criminal, and they also get involved with another man called the Darter, who may or may not be a criminal. And half the book looks at sort of Nathaniel's life as a teenager and his relationship with various characters around him, and then the second half of the book looks at Nathaniel as a slightly older man, kind of looking back and unravelling what happened and sort of solving the mystery of where his mother was. I had quite mixed feelings on this. On the one hand, like on a paragraph by paragraph level, the writing is lovely, and his writing style reminded me quite a lot of Kazuo Ishiguro, and I kind of enjoyed it for the writing in that sense. I listened to this on audiobook, and it's not a very long audiobook, and I kind of enjoyed the reading experience in that sense. On the other hand, I have no idea what this was about, or what it was trying to do, or what it was trying to say, and the main thing I was feeling at the end of this book was just that I didn't get it. I just didn't get it. And I feel like there's probably things to be got in this book that other people will have got out of this book that I just didn't get. So in that sense, I feel like the most useful thing I can say is that this just really wasn't for me. It's very dreamlike and rambling, and I couldn't like find the centre of it, which doesn't necessarily matter for everyone and doesn't necessarily matter for every book, but it wasn't really one for me. I like my historical fiction to be a little bit more plot driven, I suppose. But yeah, an interesting read, and I'm looking forward to reading more on the Walter Scott long list. Another book that I didn't get very much out of is this. This is Spring Garden by Tomoka Shibasake. I read this 3 weeks ago, and I'm not sure I could tell you what happens in it. This is a Japanese novella translated by Polly Barton, and it follows a man living in Tokyo, living in a block of flats that is soon to be pulled down. So there's very, very few people living in these block of flats now, and slowly there becomes less and less people living in this block of flats. And one other person who lives in this block of flats is a woman who he kind of embarks on a friendship with, who has this kind of obsession with a nearby house, which was the subject of a book that she found once, which has lots of photographs of that house as it used to be. And she sort of befriends the family who live in that house now in order to get access to this house because she's obsessed with like the way this house used to be in this book from many years ago. And so the main character kind of becomes involved with her obsession with this house. This was another book where I feel like I couldn't quite work out what it was about and where I couldn't quite find the centre and the focus of it. I kind of, again, enjoyed the reading experience of it, and it was also, like Warlight, really, really dreamlike. And kind of enjoyable, but also I didn't really get very much out of it. I think in 6 months' time I will have entirely forgotten this. So yeah, an interesting read, but not really one I'd recommend. Another book I read in March was The Screaming Staircase by Jonathan Stroud. This is the first in the Lockwood & Co series, and it is a series of middle grade mystery / horror books. I've read quite a few books by Jonathan Stroud before. I think he's a really fantastic middle grade author. I enjoyed Buried Fire, and the Bartimaeus trilogy is fantastic, and this I really enjoyed as well. I listened to it on audiobook, which is a really fun experience too. And the premise of Lockwood & Co is that it is set in a kind of slightly alternative version of our world where 50 years ago ghosts started appearing, and they refer to it as the problem, and everyone knows that there are ghosts and that if you go out at night there will be ghosts, and adults can't really see ghosts, but children can see ghosts, which means that children are kind of recruited to get the ghost problem under control. And our main character Lucy is part of an agency called Lockwood & Co, and she works with 2 boys called Lockwood and George. All 3 of them are, I think, sort of in their early teens, and they go around fighting ghosts and kind of solving mysteries. It's really good fun and really entertaining, and also quite scary, I have to say. I found it quite frightening. I imagine most adults would not, but I feel like middle grade horror is my level of horror. Like, horror for 10-year-olds is about as scary as I can handle. So I really enjoyed it. I found it like a really good, compelling ghost story, really good fun. I liked the world building. I feel like Jonathan Stroud is really good at doing like uncanny world building, where he kind of creates a world that is a bit like ours but not entirely like ours. I feel like he did that a lot in the Bartimaeus trilogy too. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to be carrying on with the series. Just a really, really fun, enjoyable read. And then finally I read one backlist Zaffa book. So Zaffa is where I work, and I can't really talk about books that I read for work that aren't out yet, but I can talk about books that I read for work that are backlist. I mean, a lot of the backlist books I'm reading for work, they're not, like, I don't necessarily have to read them for work, but I'm just authors where I'm working on their later books. It's quite nice to read some of their earlier books. So I read Sofia Karras Not, Obliged by Aisha Malik. I've been doing some desk editing on her 3rd book, The Green and Pleasant Land, which is coming out this summer. But so I wanted to read some of her earlier books, and Sofia Karras Not, Obliged has been like on my radar for ages and ages. When it came out several years ago, Lena Norms really, really enjoyed it, and I remember watching her talk about it on Booktube and thinking, that sounds great, and then just never getting around to it. So Sofia Karras Not, Obliged, when it first came out, was marketed as the kind of Muslim Bridget Jones, and I have to say that I like it rather a lot more than Bridget Jones. I had mixed feelings on Bridget Jones, which I enjoyed, but I found not always believable, sometimes a bit frustrating, and none of the minor characters to be very well developed, and also not that funny. Whereas Sofia Karras Not, Obliged is hilarious. I was listening to this on audiobook, and I generally spent like so much time laughing out loud, and then also some time in tears. It's really, really engaging, really, really fun. It follows a woman called Sofia Khan. She works in publishing. Someone at work suggests that she writes a book about Muslim dating. So the thread running through the book is that she's writing a book about Muslim dating, but we also follow her relationships with various men in her life and with her family and friends and all the kind of family drama. It examines cultural identity and religion and feminism and love and marriage and dating, and it's both hilarious and heartfelt. I would really, really recommend it. And like I said, look out for Aisha's 3rd book, This Green and Pleasant Land, which is coming out this summer, because it's very, very fantastic. So that is all I have to say for today. I'm sorry for this very long video. As I said, I've read a lot in March, and I don't really know how it happened, but there we go. Thanks very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books I've spoke about and what you thought of them, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.